Heartily welcome. It's a privilege to welcome you all to this podcast episode of The Four Speeches. I'm Bård Norheim and Professor of Theology at NLA University College. And as always, I'm joined with my colleague, Joar Haga. Today's theme is apology. Or we've actually had a podcast about the apology previously, but this is about sort of collective apologies, and in particular, the apology to the stolen generations, the apology given in February 2008 in Australia. And we'll come to our guest from Australia quite soon. But Joar, how is your Eurovision interest breeding or growing?
Well, it's
the Eurovision Song Contest, that is. So
I'm largely ignorant. I find it a hobby for children and women.
Okay, thanks. So we moved. To Australia. So for some strange reason, Australia joined the Eurovision Song Contest in 2015. So Graham Stanton, welcome to the podcast. You're a lecturer in practical theology at Ridley College in Melbourne. And was that a sort of a national victory for Australia when you joined the Eurovision in 2015, or was it sort of largely ironically received? How do people relate to it?
Well, all the children and women were very excited, but a lot of the men as well. Eurovision is huge here. I don't know why. I think it's maybe we're just all dags. Like you probably don't know what that word means. We're all into that sort of crazy stuff. But there were a whole lot of people that probably thought this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It probably is a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah, but it seems
it's fun. You know?
Yeah, this year, 2021, as we you've been eliminated in the semifinals. So, but people still follow the Eurovision the sort of final.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. People, are up in the middle of the night watching television.
Yeah.
I was late to church a couple of years ago because we had to wait for the final, and all that voting.
Yeah. And is the Eurovision Song Contest sort of shaping your image of European countries? So all we know about Sweden is taken from their Eurovision entries, or all we know about Norway for that sense. And it would be interesting then to hear the Australian sort of prejudices about the different sort of this is how, I mean, you have a map of Australia behind you, but it would be interesting to have a sort of Eurovision map of Europe based on the Australian outlook of Europe. Any thoughts on that?
You're telling me that you guys aren't like the Eurovision bands, that you all don't run around in tight spandex or with wind machines blowing your hair.
Now, the Swedes usually, I think the Swedes use wind machine quite frequently also in their daily life. But I think so, and I'm sorry to break it to you.
Australia's love of Eurovision goes back to ABBA, like ABBA were huge here. So we got a very soft spot. Yeah.
Anyhow, let's sort of shift gear and shift focus. Earlier this month, earlier in May 2021, on the very beginning of May, the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he apologized to indigenous Mayan people for abuses committed against them over the 5 centuries since the Spanish conquest. He focused in particular on the Caste War revolt, and in which around 250,000 people are believed to have lost their lives. So, and these are the words he spoke. We offer the most sincere apologies for the Mayan people for the terrible abuses committed by individuals and national and foreign authorities in the conquest during 3 centuries of colonial domination and 2 centuries of an independent Mexico. And he was also then joined with the Guatemalan leader Alejandro Gianmatei in the southeast state of Quintana Roo. So that was Mexico just recently, and it's not the first of apologies given by state leaders to indigenous people or First Nations. In 2008, 2009, several apologies were given both in Australia and Canada, New Zealand and the US, and we'll return to them earlier on. But Graham, I would like you to tell us a bit about the apology that was given by the Australian Parliament back in 2008, in February the 13th, the 12th, I think it was, by Kevin Rudd. And
26th of May. 26th of May.
Yeah. It's
still every year we mark National Sorry Day, which is the 26th of May, as the anniversary of that speech.
Okay.
You know, the contrast with the Mexican apology, you know, when I hear them talking about apologizing for 5 centuries of colonial oppression, Australia's colonial history is not that long. So the settlement in 1788 was the first settlement from Europeans. But the specific thing that was being apologized for was this government policy of the forcible removal of Aboriginal children from their families. And those laws were enacted from 1910 and continued up until 1970. And during that period, it's estimated that between 10 to 30% of all Aboriginal children were taken from their family and then shipped off to missions, to other sort of homes, many run by churches, but others run by the government. And so it was this, I guess, a fairly recent type experience. You know, 1970, I was alive. I wasn't very old, but it's part of my lived experience in that sense. And there are Aboriginal people today that have these stories, either their own stories of being taken, or stories that they heard from their parents or grandparents. So it was that the specific apology was being given for. So it was 10 years earlier, back in 1997, that the government had a national inquiry into this policy of removing children. And the final report of that was released in 1997, a report called Bringing Them Home. And it contained a lot of these personal stories that were awful when you hear about them, of little children you know, in their camp, and knowing that the government trucks are coming, and parents telling them to run and hide in the riverbank, but then being hunted down, found, torn away from parents, and put in the back of a truck and carted off. You know, so horrible stuff. And when that report was released in 97, there was 2 of the key recommendations were, one, for a national apology to be made to the victims of the stolen generations, and for reparation to be made. So leading up to K-Rudd's apology, there was a lot of political debate in the country about whether to do this or not. So
why wasn't it offered in 97, straight away after the report?
Yeah, it was a conservative government that was in at the time, and their response, the report didn't have binding; they were just recommendations.
Yeah.
And you know, the argument, I guess, the argument was that an apology would be too negative a way of thinking about, you know, Australian identity and culture. This would be, the phrase was, this would be a very black armband view of history. Or generally it was this criticism that we would fall into a black armband view of history that would be identifying all these things that were bad in a way that would overshadow things that were actually good, and also things that were well intentioned. So that was part of the argument, that, you know, the governments of the day, the argument run, they were doing this in the best interests of Aboriginal children. You know, so if you believe that here you've got a child who is born in a dying race, a dying culture, this culture is done. They've been overwhelmed by this colonizing force. And the best thing that we can do for these children is to rescue them from that context, so that they can be educated, they can be civilized, and they can be assimilated into white Australia. this was in their very best interests. You know? And like, no doubt there were people that within the sort of the confines of the culture of the day, they were trying to do the best for these children, you know. And it could have been worse. The policy could have been to take the children and then slaughter them on the way to a settlement, which they didn't do. But still, as we look back, we see that these were explicitly policies that were geared around this idea that the Australian Aboriginals would not survive. They were not going to survive, and therefore we'd rescue children. You know?
If we now look at the actual apology, the text or the speech, you are in just one thing in our book about the 4 speeches every leader has to know. The apology is not one of the 4 speeches in a strict sense. It's there, but we revisit it when we look at Clinton's apology after the Monica Lewinsky case in 1998, and then it's as what could have become a farewell speech, but which is a sort of apology, and which is part of what ensures him still a place in office. But these apologies are different. What sort of speech acts do you think these state apologies are given by a head of state?
They are part of, I think, it's a judicial speech. It's a verdict. It's a kind of trying to put an end to a certain storyline, or to solve it, to sort of loose tensions within society. And I think it is similar to what a judge says at the end of the negotiations that we can listen to in the courtroom.
In some sense, it's a forensic speach that awaits a verdict.
Yeah.
But
I think it is it has a different tone to it, because in a forensic speech, what you're trying to do is to make your own case in a battle of history, so to speak. But in an apology, the outcome is in some sense, not in all senses of the word, but in some sense it's a given. You are sort of framing yourself in a public space as a loser, as the one to blame. I think that's a very, you're portraying, you're revealing yourself as a sinner, and that is, I think, the essence of the apology. It's also what makes it so demanding, because it's not the usual attempt to portray yourself as virtuous. It's the opposite.
Yeah. So in some sense, I mean,
directly.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, that sense of acknowledging that these painful things have happened.
Yeah.
So
that's the
first
not arguing.
Thing. Yeah, not arguing your own case, but it's acknowledging that others have argued their case, and I'm forced to agree and recognize, yeah, this did happen. This did happen to you.
I think, Graham, thank you for this remark, because it reminds me that it has 2 aspects. The first is what has happened. I mean, it's a question of reality. This has happened. But then the second comes, who is responsible for it? And then the sort of the revelation of yourself as the one to blame for this reality, that comes to play as the second element in this.
Traditionally, you are, for those who've researched both business apologies and state apologies, they speak about the 3 A's of these apologies. First, admitting to some sort of culpability, a sort of remorse element. and then the acknowledge, telling the story of not of the perpetrator but of the victim, acknowledging that story, and then the actual apology. So the 3 A's: admit, acknowledge, apologize. But the tricky question here is that apology, directly translated, is a speech in self-defense. So here you still you do not speak as the judge. You speak in you sort of you await the response, and as a prime minister, you're responsible but not responsible. Do you see what I mean? So that's a tricky thing here. And you, Graham, spoke about this being quite recent as an important thing in comparison to the Mexican apology given by the Mexican president. Because if we now look at the actual apology, which Kevin Rudd then he made a movement to the Australian Parliament and apologized then for first he honored the Indigenous people of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We reflect on the past mistreatment, and particularly those of the stolen generations, a blemished chapter in our nation's history. And now the time has come to turn a page, and then the actual apologies come. We apologize for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering, and loss on these our fellow Australians. And then we apologize especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities, and their country. And then later on, he says, we acknowledge the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians. And then this sort of apology moves from the admittance to the acknowledging, the apology, and then the sort of future vision of what Australia could be after this apology. What more is to say about the text? Or were you there? Do you remember sort of when it was spoken out?
I was not there in Canberra, but there were events around the country. That and public events that this would be screened, and people went to big events to watch it. Lots of places around the place. I don't remember actually being in one of those gatherings, but I certainly remember that this was, it was all across the news and everything else, of course. That acknowledgement and the telling of the story, the apology itself is fairly short. Then he followed up with a 20-minute speech sort of explaining bits of it, and in that he told more of the stories, some specific stories. But certainly that was one of the big impacts on the way it was received by members of the stolen generations who are still alive, that it was like, now my experience has been validated, that like this did happen, that they acknowledged that this happened. So that was really significant for people. And as you said, I guess there is that sense of cost of acknowledgement and saying, yeah, this is part of Australia's history, which of course that was what people were sort of resisting, that to make this acknowledgement would be a negative reflection on Australia's history, or it would be a negative reading of the history, and therefore, I don't know, I guess sort of hinder our movement forward. Acknowledging it was something that he was saying was going to help us move forward. And I think at the time it had that sort of sense and received in that sort of spirit.
But so his intentions, or the intentions of his government, was in general well received, because that seems to be a very tricky thing about apologies, because part of the critique of the Mexican president, I mean, it's been commented that it was not entirely surprising that Mr. Obrador, this president, made this official apology to the Mayan people, because he's made his name as a vocal activist for Indigenous rights in the home state of Tabasco. But he was critiqued because this was just pre-election, and some people saw it as sort of a strategic step to make.
Well, people saw this in a similar sort of way in that this was Kevin Rudd's election policy. So they were campaigning and saying this is what we'll do. So they did sort of take a position in opposition to the government of the day and said, we'll be different, we're going to do this. So there was some political mileage in the campaign, I guess, in the doing of it at the beginning of his government. If they hadn't done it, they would have been absolutely pilloried. But interestingly, the leader of the opposition made a response to the apology and sort of affirmed it. But in his speech, he added a dimension where he talked about some of the social dysfunction in Aboriginal communities. And rather than saying, here is Aboriginal people as victims of a wide Australia and government policy, it really began to touch on Aboriginal people as both victim and offender. Yeah. And that did not go down well at all.
No, he was booed at, wasn't it? From what I read, Brandon Nelson, the opposition leader, for sort of making this a totally different speech then, in some sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think it was just a misreading of the situation. Like no doubt, like those realities of dysfunction in a lot of Aboriginal communities is true, but it wasn't the occasion to do it. And so he didn't read that terribly well at all. Yeah, he was booed. People turned their backs on him. And so there's been this ongoing thing that the left wing of politics in Australia tends to be much more pro-Indigenous rights, and the right wing much more resisting Indigenous rights. And so right now we've got a conservative government again, and there was another call from Indigenous leaders back in 2017 to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament, so an institutional structure that would bring Indigenous opinion to issues of national debate. And those requests have been steadfastly resisted by the government. They're saying, no, this is not going to happen. And again, the left wing of politics is saying, no, elect us and we'll pursue these things. So it is a highly politicized issue, like, I guess, like most things.
Yeah, but what do you think about this issue of the those who receive an apology? They would always, well, not always, but often be quite skeptical of the intentions of the one giving the apology, or sort of the role of the. I mean, one thing is the intention that you claim to have. The other thing is the perceived intention among the audience.
Yes, but the hard thing about intentions is that you cannot see them. So what you see is what is on display, and this is the if it's Boris Johnson in Great Britain, some people will question his motives, as they did with Donald Trump in the United States. But seen from a rhetorical perspective, it's very hard to find a true intention. And many people, I think, do not share the same suspicions as we do, or that some groups do. And I think the performative act has certain formal features that sort of display the reality, because that's the I think Graham pointed to it. Did this happen? And if it happened, and people in charge or in representing a certain political body, when they say it really did happen, I hear and I see, and this is what it is. It makes an impression. Whether their intention is good or bad, that's not so important. We see that also in the courtroom when the verdict is read aloud by the judge. We don't ask whether she is really meaning the words, because the the intention is not so important.
Yeah.
And I think it is confirmed with the hearings after the apartheid policy in South Africa, that what really mattered for people were to come forward and tell their stories, because they became public, not just private. And this move from private to public, I think that's a very powerful one.
So one of the things that the speech was criticized for is that it stopped short of mentioning anything about reparation. And that was one of the other recommendations of the Bringing Them Home report, that both an apology and reparation be made. Is that sense of, I mean, a friend of mine always says, to say sorry means you're going to change, and the speech has got this sense of, we want this to be a point from which we can now write a new chapter, turn a new page, start building a new Australia, but that's sort of fairly vague, I guess. I guess my question rhetorically, where does that, and this is what I'm going to do, where does that fit within an apology?
So the sincerity of the description hinges on many things. You can analyze the verbs or the adjectives or the nouns being used to describe it, and many times words will reverberate through the process, the after process. So if very strong words have been used, I think the reparations, as you name them, the change that follows an apology will sort of link to these words being used. So it's a very delicate thing to, if you use strong words, it binds, they bind you, so to speak. It's difficult to speak of a genocide and then act as if nothing has happened.
Yeah, but I wonder if what we're touching on now is the cost of penance. So what's the cost of apologizing? Or as you said with your friend, if you say sorry, we expect you to change, or we expect you to do something to prove that this costs something, or else. So when I was talking about intentions, it was not as you say, well, we can't see the intentions, but it's the perceived intentions among the audience. So they will, and then it was interesting that you mentioned Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, because they come with a particular ethos. So did probably Kevin Rudd, and for sure John Howard, the prime minister before that. So if you're a judge in a court of law, you come with an ethos that belongs to your office more than just your politics in some sense. And if we look at some apologies that hasn't been that successful, when just a few in the same year in 2008, the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, stood before Parliament in the House of Commons and delivered also an official statement of apology, which got a much more mixed response, it seems. It was a very similar one thematically. It also had this report leading up to it, but it led to that Justin Trudeau gave another apology in 2017 on the 24th of November, where he started by crying and sort of entered into another ethos. And Trudeau in himself has another political ethos that was perceived otherwise than the Conservative Prime Minister back in 2008. So I think here, so one thing is the intentions, and then the hard stuff is the penance part, the cost. I mean, one option would be to ask simply to acknowledge the dialogical or sort of aporetic nature of apology. You don't know what the response will be. That's what I mean by aporetic. You don't know how it will be received. So you can ask, what can we do to mend this simply? That's, most politicians wouldn't risk that. They wouldn't risk just ending the speech with a question. So if you look at Kevin Rudd's speech, it ends with a vision of the future Australia.
And he has the response, like in the middle, we the Parliament of Australia respectfully request that this apology be received in the spirit in which it is offered as part of the healing of the nation. So it's interestingly, that's the only imperative in it is to the victim. We want you to do this. We want you to receive this in the spirit it's made. But in terms of the action of the people who are doing the apology, the only thing I can really see is the line, we're taking the first step towards a future where this Parliament resolves that the injustices of the past must never, never happen again. Interestingly, even it's the word, the injustice of the past must never, never happen again, not that they will not ever happen again. It's not like we're saying this is what we're going to do to ensure that they don't. We're just making an expression now that these are terrible, they really must not happen. I can understand why people would look at this and say, for all the good that was done, and no doubt there was, like that acknowledgement, as you're talking about the sort of words chosen, governments have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss, pain, suffering and hurt, apologizing especially for the removal of children from their families, their communities, their country. There is a sense of depth and breadth in what's being acknowledged. I think that's the real strength of what's being done here.
But I wonder if the problem with talking about reparations straight away is that money is dirty. And this style of speech is not necessarily fully in the grand style all the way, but it's sort of ceremonial. It's using big words, as you just mentioned. So if then the Prime Minister would say, after a future where all Australians, whatever their origins, are truly equal partners with equal opportunities and with an equal stake in shaping the next chapter in the history of this great country, Australia. And then just 2 seconds pause, and then he would say, and now to reparations. I suggest that we offer, it would sort of kill the moment in a sense.
Totally.
But it's a real dilemma, because in Norway, with children who went to mission boarding schools, they've been frustrated. They had a similar process of a report acknowledging the experiences, a formal apology by mission leaders, and then actually a number of court cases where they've tried to file a case against the mission organization that they were responsible for the abuse of these residential schools. And so far, the mission organizations have won, to put it in quotation marks, but it's a different thing. How do you what do you think? How do you address the issue of the cost or reparations within an apology?
Yes, there are. It's part of the political solution in a sense, and I don't think money is that dirty. You could say if it's framed as a compensation, it's sort of dirty. If you look at it as a payment for irreparable damage, but as a structural solution to the, for example, in Norway, the erection of a Sami parliament up in north with limited, but with a very strong cultural, limited political influence, but strong cultural significance. That was seen as a structural component of the attempt to reintegrate, because the politicians face the real challenge is, of course, that the indigenous people and their rights they go contrary to the whole political system in itself, and not only as a sort of a power struggle, but also it goes to the heart of the democratic issue itself, namely the question of property. And I cannot imagine any politician in Norway, for example, that would give up, say, national sovereignty or something. You know, the whole idea that you own the land, I cannot imagine. But that's where the real problem lies. And therefore also the apology speech has limits.
But it was interesting that you should mention the Sami parliament and the rights of the indigenous people in Norway. At the third seating of the Sami parliament in October 1997, the King of Norway, King Harald V, he spoke at the opening of the Sami parliament. And there he said that the Norwegian state is founded on the territory of two people, the Norwegians and the Sami people. And today we have to apologize for the injustice that's been done by the Norwegian state, inflicted on the Sami people through a strong Norsification, I don't know the exact term, or trying to make them Norwegians then over several centuries, starting with the mission organizations in the 18th century and onwards. And that speech was really well received in the Sami community in Norway, probably because the king was the first to do it. And they also said, we trust the king. And for one, the king is not up for re-election. But I think it was this acknowledging of the territory, which was, I don't know, from hearing what you say, you are probably a Norwegian politician could say something similar, but we're then touching up on something very, the question of property then is a key issue here.
Yeah, and it's a concrete cost, isn't it? That there's that, like I get that what you said earlier, Bård, that if Kevin Rudd had, finished the speech and said, and for each person who was removed, they're going to receive a ex gratia payment of, $10,000. That's totally the wrong mood. But he could have said something like, we resolve that the injustices of the past must never happen again. We resolve that within the term of this parliament, we will explore appropriate reparation for those who have been victims of this gross injustice,
Yes.
But he didn't say that. And, so with my own children, when they were little, teaching them how to say sorry, we tried to give them a set of words, I'm sorry for, and then you had to say what you were sorry for. And then they had to say, will you forgive me? Okay. So that was the pattern. I'm sorry for what? Will you forgive me? And the two parts were, there's the acknowledgement, and we've spoken about the acknowledgement. This is trying to avoid the, say sorry to your sister. Sorry, you want to get away from that, So we're trying as parents. But the acknowledgement, but then the will you forgive me, it is that moment of extreme vulnerability. That is a significant part of the repentance thing. It's like, I put myself in your power. I can't say I forgive myself. That's not a legitimate speech act. So forgiveness needs to be offered so I can ask for it. But until you respond, then I'm totally at your mercy. And that seems missing here, and I don't know how well the politics of doing it. I don't know how you would do that. But one of our theologians here, Peter Adam, has thought and written a lot about Indigenous relations, and he has the line. He says that every interaction about Indigenous affairs between settler Australians and the Indigenous community needs to begin with the question, do you want us to leave? And he makes the point that, of course, it's not really going to be possible for settler Australians to leave. But he says that's where the conversation needs to start. And then we work through the difficulty of that? If the answer is yes, then okay, we're in a difficult situation, because I don't think we're going to be able to. I mean, for many Indigenous Australians, the answer is no. We don't want you to leave, but but something of that sense of, we acknowledge this and we say sorry. And I think, Board, you've written on this of that sort of question. Now, what do you want us? What do you want us to do? What do you want us to do?
Yeah.
Rather than this apology is saying, and now this is what we want you to do. And then, of course, now we're going to have this grand future. When you ask the question, what was the cost to the Australian government of making this apology? There's a cost in acknowledging, and I believe there is that personal cost of acknowledging that. But there's a lot of political credibility that he gained as a result. And heck, here we are talking about his speech many years later. But in terms of the structural cost to the Australian government and to the Australian people, it was. But you can understand why people would dismiss it as it was just words, and the situation hasn't changed.
But
young Indigenous people are still incarcerated 20 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. The life expectancy of Indigenous Australians is still 9 years less than non-Indigenous. So there's all these enduring problems that certainly weren't solved by this apology.
I think what you point at is a very interesting paradox, namely the difference between a personal apology and a political apology. And I don't think you can solve the tension between the two, because you can ask the question, do you want us to leave? But it's an irreal question. It's not a real one.
And it's also unclear who is us.
Exactly. And it's point that, so the drama of the speech in a political apology has other hinges. It hinges on other sort of coordinates in drawing up the map, and the key words are different than existential personal relations. And because this is for example, take the question of legislation. The government is not allowed to give binding legislation in a post Rousseau or Montesquieu world. They are given to Parliament, but Parliament cannot state an official apology themselves. So it's a complicated in the structure itself that democracy is. So and then you have, of course, the great problem. What about the majority of the people? Do you need the majority of the people to give certain sorries, so to speak?
Yeah.
So this is a and I think the danger for the apologizing prime minister is to say too little, but it's also to say too much, to promise too much.
It's because his apology is in some sense surrogate. He's apologizing on behalf of something else and someone else. And then if you go too far, you enter into an ethos that's not yours in some sense. I want to touch on another issue of the apology, and that's the fact that it's actually spoken out loud. And let's just contrast it with the critique that was directed at the US President Barack Obama, because on December 19th in 2009, he signed off the Native American Apology Resolution, which was part of a defense appropriation spending bill. And the critique of that apology was that it was not said out loud. And there was no one to hear whether the apology given or the one giving the apology really expressed some sort of remorse, and they were not drawing any attention to it. So from the indigenous people, the indigenous communities in the US, they were really critical of this because it was sort of hidden away. And that's, we touched upon this earlier, but the importance of this being moving from the private to the public, or from the hidden to the open. And it seems to me that from the videos you sent me, Graham, and from the footage, people were sitting in the open outside, watching on big screens when this apology was given. Of course, that was staged, one could say, but at the same time, it's really ceremonial.
Yeah, and you know, people did turn out for it. You know, so the speech, because it had to be made in Parliament. That's a specific room. It's got visitors galleries, but it can't seat that many. So a certain number of people there. But then it was streamed also into then a much larger meeting room within the Parliament building, and then onto the front lawn of the Parliament House where people gathered, and then in capital cities around the country. So here in Melbourne, just down the road at Federation Square, there were big screens and people gathered. So yeah, I agree that the publicness of this, it becomes an event, is pretty significant. And particularly, I hadn't known about the Obama thing, but when you say it was attached to an military appropriations bill, like, I've watched enough West Wing to know that these are the sorts of things that people throw in, and they just say yes to it so that they can get their main agenda through. You know, and so the implication that an apology to the Indigenous people is just something that we'll say yes to because we're being, you know, held over the fire on something that we really want. That's not a good look.
No, but it's a bit like going back to your children and our children. It's if one of the children were to say, "I have apologized. I've written a note. You can find it in the drawer over there," and or I whispered it in the corner. Didn't you hear? Oh, that's your problem.
But but again, there's a difference between the perception of going public. I think what you mentioned, about the privacy of the hidden and the public of the open speech, it's a great difference. And normally, at least in the political culture in Norway, most important questions concerning economy, for example, economic questions, they are solved at the backstage, where people, we had a social democratic rule here with absolute majority in the parliament for 20 years, and their saying used to be, someone has had a word with another. So the policy is clear. We don't have to debate it because it's settled before it's even opened. On the other hand, the idea of a democracy leads to the impression that things of importance are treated in the open, and that gives an impression of reality. And even if it's not real in the sense of economy or military dispositions or things like that, they matter. It is of a real concern what is being said, and I don't tap into this Eliza Doolittle words, and they don't matter, because they do. I think that's the most important thing with the postmodern identity politics, is that words matter. It's a rhetorical dimension of reality.
But Graham, talking about words which matter, this speech was given in 2008. How is it not received but perceived today, or what's been the aftermath of that? You talked a bit about this, but what sort of in which way did this speech make Australia into what Australia is today? If you see what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons it was timed for the 26th of May is because the 27th of May is another significant date in Australia's history. So that was what the anniversary of a national referendum in 1967 that changed some references to Aboriginal people within the Constitution. At the time was that sense of acknowledging Aboriginal people as citizens. That before then they were counted in the census, but the number of Aboriginal people was not used to determine government policy or distribution of resources, or the assignment of votes in the Parliament was based on the population of non-Indigenous Australians. So that was a significant event, 27th of May 1967, and then the 3rd of June 1992. So that was the High Court Mabo decision, which is where the High Court recognised native title and the existence of native title, and that terra nullius was a lie. So that week, 27th of May to the 3rd of June every year is Reconciliation Week. And then the 26th of May, the day before Reconciliation Week, is National Sorry Day. And so there are events every year with this sense, and going back to Kevin Rudd's speech. So there is that enduring sort of mark on the Australian cultural landscape that has come from this. And so the idea that an apology has been made does have that sense of, yes, we've done that, and that's a good thing. The question is, was the apology the beginning of something new, or was the apology an accomplishment of something that we can now move on from? And I think that in just the popular culture of Australia, there's a lot of people who would think, look, we've done this. Why are we still talking about this Aboriginal thing? We said sorry. It's time to move on. Where are my land rights? Like, I'm an Indigenous Australian. I was born here. So that sort of rhetoric you continue to hear. But of course, the social disadvantage of Aboriginal people continues, which I mentioned before. Now the movement there's been a lot of talk about a treaty. So in contrast to Canada and New Zealand, where the English colonized, they signed treaties with the local Indigenous people. One of the complications in Australia is that there's not one Indigenous people group, but there are hundreds. So that's the map on the wall behind me. This is a map of Indigenous languages. So all the different coloured blots are a different language group. So how do you write a treaty? You got to choose what language you're going to write it in, and there are hundreds. So it's very complicated. But there's still those moves for, so we need a treaty, we've got to do something. There's the Uluru Statement from the Heart of 2017 calling for both a voice to Parliament and Makarrata Commission, which Makarrata is an Aboriginal word, which similar sort of idea to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So wanting something that would continue to give that acknowledgement of not just stolen generations, but other aspects of Indigenous experience. So, the conversation continues. And so I think in that sense, this was a significant moment. I think if the apology hadn't been made, I think we still would have been stuck back at that level of the process. Like if the process of Indigenous reconciliation has got various steps in it, then okay, yeah, we've the apology, or an apology for this particular thing that's been made, and we can move on to other things. But we need to keep moving forward. That's the challenge.
But Graham, it's an interesting part of what you're saying is the question: do you think like a national apology day or a sorry day or whatever you call it, would that be could that be counterproductive for the actual action? Is it a you know, because it reflects the approach from the political left where I live, namely, if you overload the children with guilt about pollution, then you create a certain reservoir for green action. But that might not be the case. I mean, it's something that we think, you know, it's a good thing to remember things so we don't do them again. But the political energy in it is sort of unstable.
Yeah. And I guess the challenge, I think, is always what do we do with these things moving forward? I don't think it's necessarily bad that we do acknowledge that there is this generational hurt, disadvantage that continues. You know, I think it would have been different if, well, the apology didn't change the fact that these things still happen.
Yeah.
You know? That they happened, yes, and that the consequences of them still happen. The consequences remain with us. And there are other aspects of Indigenous disadvantage that continue. So an ongoing acknowledgement, I think, is significant. But I think also connected with Reconciliation Week, which has more of that forward-looking thing. So maybe there's a nice connection there when I stop to think about it. I haven't really articulated this myself before, but that the acknowledgement of the past and the moving from there into the future. I mean, that's a significant sort of spiritual move as well when you think about the lament and the praise. You know, that ability to be able to sit with and hold the pain and acknowledge that, and not sidestep it and pretend it didn't happen, but neither to get stuck there where all we can do is wail, but the lament which acknowledges that and then takes hold of a promise. Then perhaps you've got a bit of that in Sorry Day and Reconciliation Week.
But I'm wondering, Graham, what we're discussing now is the whole liturgy of penance, because this is sort of a national liturgy of at least you remembering a past which is not heroic. So one thing for you as example here to talk about climate action would be to hear stories or speeches from the heroic side and not appealing to lament or moral guilt. Whereas here you remember, and there's some element here of making that moral guilt alive again. If it was your personal moral guilt, it could be another year has been added, and I've done things, I've thought my misdeeds are there before me, and I could confess them. Whereas with this sort of national liturgy, there has to be of remembrance. It has to be more about gaining a deeper understanding, so of what it means today. But it's a tricky thing, this collective versus the personal, and the surrogate versus the me as the actual perpetrator.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I should add that when we say we mark National Sorry Day and Reconciliation Week, it's like it's a day that's sort of declared. It's not a public holiday, and there's no compulsion nationally to do things. Like if you're at a government school, then you'll be almost guaranteed to do something, and even in private schools they would do something. But you know, Australia Day is much more the enduring shape of Australian culture, and Australia Day is the anniversary of the British colonisation settlement in Sydney. And so, you know, that gets, people talk about that as Invasion Day, and so there's lots of, I mean, that's highly contested. But you know, Australia Day, the 26th of January, it's summer, everybody's on the beach. It's a great day to be Australian, and a day that, you know, most people don't want to think about the negative things of history, you know, but it's really contested. It's becoming much more of a political issue to change the date. That's a big movement, you know, hashtag change the date, hashtag Invasion Day, and all that sort of thing. So in terms of shaping the national psyche, you'd still be looking at Australia Day and Anzac Day. They're the two big things. Anzac Day is the national sort of military Veterans Day type thing. Anzac Day on the 26th of April, which marks the Gallipoli landings in the First World War. Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. So they were part of the British invasion force. And it was a terrible defeat. Gallipoli was a disaster of a military campaign, and that's the thing that becomes our National Military Day, this terrible military defeat. Although it's sort of told of the story of the brave and courageous Australian and New Zealanders were sent to their slaughter by the Ponzi English incompetent generals. Yeah. And it was here was when Australia came of age, you know, and the Australian national character was sort of built.
But both those days are still told as heroic events. Then
yeah.
But
yeah, that's right. So the heroic thing is still very much, that's probably more the dominant thing. Although I think that the political force is shifting. There is more and more move to acknowledge things of the past, to be more productive, shift the National Day away from that day of colonisation, and find something that's going to be more productive for the country.
Very quickly, you are, before we have to end this.
Yeah, it's just the use of history. I will, as a historian, I will like to point out that history also has a resistance in itself to being used. So you can, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, wrote a small booklet called "Why Study the Past," and one of his arguments was that it is a strange land. There's a strangeness to the past, and well, as I understood him, there's something unknown about it. It means that you cannot use it to the full extent, so to speak. You have to discover it again, and I think that is also important to know that there are moral limits as to how you can use it, as they say in practical theology, constructively, because it has as its own thing a resistance. Okay, so I'll
but then we'll do another exercise. Then I totally get your point. That we'll use the present to look into the future, which is also has some limits to it. But what do you think we will apologize for 50 years from now? Or what will our state leaders apologize for 50 years, 100 years from now? Because that's another exercise with at least potentially self-critical, of course, also political view on the present situation. What sort of apologies, if any, will we have in the?
Well, it's difficult because when we review the past, it's always with we are looking on it from the perspective of the present. But I, as a farmer, and when I look into my cow's eyes, I can feel a certain threat from the future, that we are eating these creatures that will not be looked upon with grace. I am afraid.
So you expect that some of your grandson will then?
Yes. Well, I have a certain sympathy with the vegetarians. I'm not a vegetarian myself, and I probably will never be. But there's the sacrifice of animals for feeding us.
Mm.
I don't think that is taken into account in modern society. I think it more so in earlier days, but the industrial production of meat, I hardly think that we will have a graceful review in 50 years.
But
Maybe
of course,
we'll
who do you
also be-
apologize? Sorry, Graham. Yeah.
Maybe somebody's also going to be apologizing for Eurovision at some point.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, but I mean, the question remains, how will it be received by the audience? That will be even more tricky when your grandson will apologize to your bulls. Don't you think? Yeah. So with these, with looking into the bullseye here at the end, we end this episode of the podcast, The Four Speeches. Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you to Graham Stanton for joining us from Australia. This was another episode of the podcast, The Four Speeches.